This is the very picturesque Loch Katrine. The sign on the marina says it is the birthplace of Scottish tourism.
That's quite a boast, but not why we're here today.
Over there behind me, at the head of the loch, is Glengyle, the birthplace of a legend. A celebrity outlaw, the Scottish Robin Hood. Or was he? Welcome to Scotland Unplugged and the story of Rob Roy MacGregor.
We don't know his date of birth, but we do know he was baptised on the 7th of March 1671.
353 years ago today. So, not so much happy birthday, but happy as close as we can get to your birthday.
These days, the area around the loch is owned by Scottish Water. The loch itself is Glasgow's water supply. Glengyle is around 3 miles walk up a gated private road.
It's a bit of a hike, especially when you have to go back to top up the parking.
I might have underestimated the amount of time filming takes.
The house over there behind me is actually built on the site of the house Rob was born in. And according to a sign just over there, there's a burial ground behind it, containing the remains of many of the MacGregor chiefs.
The name Rob Roy is actually an anglicisation of Rob Ruig, the Scots Gaelic for Red Rob, on account of his hair. But he probably didn't look like this. This was painted in the 19th century.
His father, Donald Glass MacGregor, was the younger brother of a Clan MacGregor chief and a tacksman, pretty high up in the clan pecking order. Tacksmen were generally related to clan chiefs and usually rented land and then sublet it to other tenants. Rob's mother, Margaret, was a Campbell. More on that later.
Tacksmen were also responsible for gathering troops in times of war, which is why, when Rob was 18, he went with his father to join the 1689 Jacobite uprising.
In 1688, James VII of Scotland and II of England and Ireland abdicated and went to France when his son-in-law William of Orange turned up in Devon with an army. James wasn't that popular with everyone, and William had actually been invited by his own subjects. But he was a Stuart king, and in Scotland he still had some loyal supporters.
At the Battle of Killiecrankie on the 27th of July 1689, the force led by John Graham, Viscount Dundee, known as Bonnie Dundee, and Sir Ewan Cameron of Lochiel, were outnumbered, but they defeated a British government army commanded by Hugh Mackay. I've said before that Jacobite rebellions weren't Scotland versus England, and Hugh Mackay sounds kinda local.
Bonnie Dundee was killed, and that pretty much killed the rebellion.
Rob's father was imprisoned for high treason, and his mother took ill, leaving Rob in charge. The name MacGregor was enough to get you flung in prison, so Rob used the name Campbell.
He worked as a cattle drover. In 17th century Scotland, that performed a very valuable function, getting cattle from their hillsides to market and vice versa. He also had a pretty interesting side hustle in cattle theft and blackmail.
The term blackmail is actually a Scottish one, but it dates back a bit further than Rob. For a protection fee, Rob and his men would ensure nothing bad happened to your cattle, as long as you paid them 5% of your rent. If the cattle inadvertently went missing, he would either see to it that they were returned or that you were compensated.
And if you didn't pay, they were likely to go missing anyway. Amazingly, this was normal, even considered respectable at the time. Cattle theft or reaving was pretty much standard practice. If you weren't looking after your herd, you didn't deserve to keep them, kind of a thing.
He built his reputation over time and became a well-respected cattleman. Then he got more ambitious and decided to expand his own herd. He borrowed money from various creditors, but either one of his men absconded with the money or it went missing some other way.
The Duke of Montrose was his main creditor. He had Rob declared an outlaw, seized his land, then threw his family off and burned down his house. And that kicked off a blood feud. Rob started raiding the Duke's cattle and stealing his rent. He moved to Glenshira in 1716 under the protection of John Campbell, the Duke of Argyll. The story goes that he was allowed to move there in exchange for surrendering his arms, but that he actually handed over a pile of rusty old weapons. The Duke of Argyll and the Duke of Montrose didn't really gel. Their land was close and they were rivals, and Rob lived in between. He seems to have enjoyed playing them off against each other.
In 1717, following that 1715 uprising, the British government passed the Indemnity Act. The Act pardoned anyone who'd taken part in the 1715 uprising, apart from the MacGregors. You get the feeling they were kind of out to get him.
In 1719, he took part in the Battle of Glenshiel, another Jacobite fight, this time involving the Spanish. He supposedly tried to help Lord Seaforth, but didn't quite make it on time. That was becoming a recurring theme, and some historians have speculated that Rob, despite being a Jacobite on the surface, held back from joining the fight. He's even been accused of holding back until the fighting had finished in order to loot from both sides. He carried on his feud with the Duke of Montrose. At one point, he's said to have imprisoned the Duke's factor, his rent collector, on an island just over there, now known as Factor's Island.
Eventually though, he was caught and forced to surrender to General Wade. Then he was locked up in Newgate Prison in London.
But his fame had grown. The highly fictionalised version of his life story, The Highland Rogue, had been published in 1723. The book told tall tales of Rob's exploits and some of the tricks he'd supposedly pulled, and he was popular. He was even popular with George I, the reigning monarch, who very definitely wasn't a Jacobite.
In 1727, just before he was due to be transported to Jamaica, he was released and pardoned by the king. By 1722, he'd moved to a house here in Balquhidder.
And here is where he returned.
He's said to have died peacefully in his bed in 1734, aged 63. Not 70 like it says on the inscription on his grave. If this is his grave, there's some debate about it. And while I say peacefully, there are a couple of versions of the story that have him dying slowly from a wound he sustained in a duel. His story is pretty fantastical, no doubt exaggerated in the first version, and then even more so when Walter Scott got hold of the tale and published his novel Rob Roy in 1817. It shouldn't be that much of a surprise that we think of him as the Scottish Robin Hood. Walter Scott pretty much invented what we think of as the English Robin Hood.
There have been more books, poetry from William Wordsworth, and a few films. The legend gets bigger and bigger with every retelling. We'll never know who he really was, and maybe that's the point.
I suspect we don't really want to know the truth, and maybe the story or stories of his life, the mystery and the reinvention, are what keep him fresh, and ultimately, kind of alive.